For the last 50 years, no exceptions, overall prices have gone up in America. They have not gone down. So we've been lulled into thinking that inflation is inevitable, but it's not. I'm going to prove that. We're going to prove that right now. This is a graph from Oregon State University, price levels in America from 1665, the days of the Pilgrims, until now. I want you to notice that for the first 250 years of our history, there was zero net inflation. If you bought a pair of shoes in 1900, they would have cost you about the same as they did back in George Washington days. No inflation for 250 years, but look at that spike on the right. Now some people might say, well, Mr. Perloff, it wasn't a flat line back then. No, there were some blips in the graph. What were those blips? Those blips were wars. Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War. Well, what happened is, during these wars, the American government would print money to help pay the cost of the war. Of course, when you print money, money loses its value, prices go up. But notice that after those wars, prices always went back to their usual value. But check it out, World War I, we inflate again, but this time money does not go back to its usual value, and then it just takes off like a skyrocket. Something must have happened, right? There's no effect without a cause. What was that cause? The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Now the chairman of the Federal Reserve is a member. That is not photoshopped in any way. That is an actual picture of Bernanke testifying before Congress. The Fed chairman has been called the economic czar of America because he and the Federal Reserve Board set interest rates. And by doing that, they also control the direction of the stock market. If they make interest rates go high, CDs will start to look attractive. People are going to take their money out of the riskier stock market. But if interest rates go really low like they are now, a lot of money is going to flow into the stock market. Now, how did the Federal Reserve get started? Most people would say, I have no idea. It must have been some act of our government, right? Yes, Federal Reserve Act of 1913, but who was the man who introduced the original legislation? It was this man, Senator Nelson Aldrich. Now, most people today don't know who Nelson Aldrich was, but a lot of people still remember this man, Nelson Rockefeller. He was vice president under Gerald Ford, long governor of New York, a billionaire, one of the most powerful men in the world. His full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. He was named for his grandfather, Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and whose son, Winthrop Aldrich, became president of the Rockefeller's Chase National Bank. They were closely interlocked, and insiders knew that when Senator Aldrich spoke on Capitol Hill, he was speaking for the Rockefellers and their allies in the world of high finance. But here's what you need to know about the legislation that Aldrich brought forward for the Federal Reserve. He didn't write a word of it. The Federal Reserve legislation was actually carved out at a private 9-day meeting in secret on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia in 1910. Now, today Jekyll Island is open to the public, but at that time was the private retreat of the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Astors, and the Vanderbilts. And some people would say, well, Mr. Perloff, that's just a crazy conspiracy theory. Actually, it's not. You can go down to Jekyll Island today and stay at the Jekyll Island Club Hotel, and they'll let you see their Federal Reserve Room, which is the room, that's what they call it, the Federal Reserve Room, where the Federal Reserve legislation was written. And the guy who first broke the story on Jekyll Island was actually B.C. Forbes, founder of Forbes magazine. And one of the men who attended it, the meeting at Jekyll Island, wrote about it in his memoirs. Remember I was talking about the Spanish-American War and how National City Bank, the forerunner of Citibank, loaned America $200 million to fight that war. Well, that loan was negotiated by the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip. After the war, he left the government, and National City Bank rewarded him by making it their president. And as their president, he attended the Jekyll Island meeting and wrote about it 25 years later. Here's what Frank Vanderlip wrote. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the terminal of the New Jersey Littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. The discovery, we knew, simply must not happen. If it would be discovered that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. So who's at the meeting? Well, the world's 3 biggest banking houses were represented at this meeting. And believe it or not, they represented 25% of all the wealth in the world at that time. Representing the house of Rockefeller was Senator Aldrich on the right and Frank Vanderlip. Representing the house of J.P. Morgan, were left to right, Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, Henry Davison, senior partner, J.P. Morgan and Company, and Charles Norton, head of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. But the most important man at the meeting, and the man who actually ran it, was Paul Warburg, who was there representing the Rothschild European interests. Now, again, most people today wouldn't recognize the name Paul Warburg, but he was well recognized in his day. And if you've ever seen the musical Annie, or the comic strip it was based upon, Little Orphan Annie, you might recall that Annie had a rich benefactor, the richest man in the world, Daddy Warbucks. Well, Daddy Warbucks was just a caricature of Paul Warburg. The cartoonist simply took the name Warburg and changed it to Warbucks. I don't think that Daddy Warbucks is a particularly good representation of Paul Warburg. If you were looking for a fictional banker to represent him, I think this guy probably did a better job.
Yeah.
But who is Paul Warburg? Paul Warburg was a German banker. He had long worked in association with the Rothschilds, establishing central banks in Europe, and they made immense profits by having the central banks loan money to the governments of Europe. And in 1902, the Rothschilds sent Warburg to America with instructions to found a similar bank here. As soon as he arrived here, he became a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was the Rothschilds' banking satellite in New York City. And he quickly formed an alliance with John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. This alliance was nothing new because the Rothschilds had provided the seed money for John D.'s Standard Oil fortune, and they bailed out J.P. Morgan when he was in trouble in the 19th century. Now in 1907, J.P. Morgan, who controlled a large number of newspapers, started a phony rumor about the insolvency of some rival banks. And that led to runs on these banks. If you've seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, they have a perfect example of a run on the bank. You know, banks, of course, make money by loaning out money on deposit. But in those days, before they had FDIC insurance, you know, if a bank loaned out too much money and the depositors panicked, all wanted their money at once, the bank could collapse, and depositors who didn't withdraw in time could lose everything. That's what happened in 1907. And following the so-called panic of 1907, Rockefeller's newspapers and Morgan's newspapers and Senator Aldrich in Congress began clamoring, America must have a central bank to avoid further such catastrophes. But why did they want a central bank? Well, he supposed Woodrow Wilson appointed vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, where he would set America's interest rates. Paul Warburg. Who gets appointed head of the New York Federal Reserve, nucleus of the system? Benjamin Strong. The very men who sat at Jekyll Island and planned the Federal Reserve in secret were now given control of it. The foxes were running the hen house. But why do they want a central bank in the first place? Well, Paul Warburg at Kuhn Loeb and Company was making a salary of $500,000 a year. That was a lot of money back then. That's like well over $10 million in today's dollars. He gave that up for a Federal Reserve position that paid $12,000 a year. Now, why did he do that? Patriotic altruism, Mr. Perloff, wanted to stabilize the economy? Let me suggest this. Paul Warburg said to himself, why should I make a piddling, diddling, measly $500,000 a year at Kuhn Loeb when I can make countless millions for myself and my friends in high finance by setting interest rates in America? I snapped my fingers once. Stock market's going up. Snap them twice. Stock market, she's going to go down. Which brings us to motive number one for the creation of the Federal Reserve, which is control of the stock market. Now, I do like to become my own critic once in a while. Mr. Perloff, I've been listening to here tonight, yipping and yapping about this conspiracy this, conspiracy that. Give me a break, will you? Listen, folks, let me get the real deal, okay? This guy Perloff's trying to pass himself off as a serious student of history. No way. You know what he is? He is a conspiracy theory nut. I'm going to prove it to you. Because unknown to Mr. Perloff, I had him followed around by a detective, okay, recently. I'm going to prove to you he has the 10 top characteristics of a conspiracy theory nut. Number one, his eyes are crossed. See that? He can't even focus them, okay? Number two, he foams at the mouth. Look at him ranting and raving about his strange political ideas. Number 3 is paranoid about this country's leaders. Look at that. Can't you just hear him saying, they're out to get me? I never miss it. I.e., the government is out to get me. Number 4, like all these conspiracy guys, a member of a militia group, very violent, you know. Number 5, he's got conspiracy on the brain. You know, that's all the guy thinks about all day is conspiracy. You know what? If his Aunt Tilly falls down the stairs, they'll say, David Rockefeller must have put you. Yeah, sure, give me a break. Number 6, not very bright. You know, if you double this guy's IQ, I bet you get a 2-digit number. Number 7, and this is particularly sad, the poor goof really believes that Elvis Presley is still alive and living on a UFO. In fact, if you listen carefully, I think you can hear Elvis in Mr. Perloff's brain. Yeah, you're lonely tonight, loser. Give me a break. Okay, number 8, the state of Idaho, like all these conspiracy theorists. You know, he probably lives up there in a shack with a one-eyed hound dog, a sawed-off shotgun, driving around in a pickup truck, you know. Number 9, Mr. Perloff's a member of the Birch Society, and like all Birches, every night he looks under his bed to make sure there's no sneaking, dirty commies hiding there. Number 10, okay, he found one commie. Big deal. Hey, look, the guy's been looking at his bed every night for the last 10,000 nights. He's bound to find one sooner or later. That's just the law of averages. But reason number 10, that Mr. Perloff is a nut you can't trust. They come to take him away.
Now you see I've gone completely out of my mind.
Well,
they're coming to take me away.
yeah, I think that about demolishes Mr. Perloff's explanations here. All right. Well,
life is beautiful.
well, for anyone who thinks this only believed in by conspiracy theory nuts, I'd like to quote another conspiracy theory nut named Charles Lindbergh, and most of you know Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, first man to make a solo flight across the Atlantic. But a lot of people don't know that his father, Charles Lindbergh Sr., was one of the most eminent men in Congress, and he fought bitterly against the Federal Reserve Act. In fact, he tried to impeach the entire Federal Reserve Board, including Paul Warburg. I had a couple of articles in the New American on the Lindberghs this year. Now, Congressman Lindbergh stood up when this Federal Reserve Act was being proposed. Here's what he said on the floor of the House. He said, "This act, the Federal Reserve Act, establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized." What does he mean by the money power? He's talking about the alliance between the houses of Rothschild, Morgan, and Rockefeller. The money power overawes the legislative and executive forces of the nation. I have seen these forces exerted during the different stages of this bill. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The new law will create inflation whenever the trust wants inflation. Check it out. Was he right? Check it out. No inflation before the Federal Reserve Act, skyrocketing inflation afterwards. He's exactly right. Continuing with his quote now. If the trust can get a period of inflation, they figure they can unload stocks on the people at high prices during the excitement, and then bring on a panic and buy them back at low prices. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. Once again, words of prophecy. That day of reckoning was the stock market crash of 1929, which wiped out millions of small investors, but not the big boys. Paul Warburg, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, his son, is now taken over, and other people who operate in this circle like Bernard Baruch and Joseph P. Kennedy. They were all out of the stock market when it crashed in 1929. Now, their official biographers say it's because they had such financial wisdom. It just wasn't wisdom, it was control. When you're running the Federal Reserve Board and you knew in advance that interest rates were going to almost double in 1929, which they did, you knew to be out of the stock market. Plus, they used a lot of dirty tricks. They sold stocks short to get the snowball panic rolling, and they also called in loans on people who had borrowed money to buy stocks to force them to dump the stock on the market. And then they went back in and bought stock at 10 cents on the dollar. Louis McFadden, who was chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency from 1920 to 31, said this about the stock market crash. It was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as rulers of us all. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of these United States did not perceive that a world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers acting together for their own pleasure. Give one more short quote. It's from Curtis Dahl, who was Franklin D. Roosevelt's son-in-law, syndicate manager for Lehman Brothers, He was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on the day of the crash. He said of the crash, it was the calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers. But controlling the stock market was not the only reason they wanted to create the Fed. Another was the creation of money from nothing. And the best book on this, Kip, do we have this book on sale today? Oh, okay, but it's a great book to get. The Creature from Jekyll Island by J. Griffin. Now, we have a very expensive government, as you know. You know, under Obama, our deficits have been running over $1 trillion a year. Not our budget, but our deficits, $1 trillion a year, which means that the federal government spends about $3 billion more than it takes in each day of the year. Now, how does our government take in money? Well, through income tax, right, and by selling bonds. But actually, bonds are a lousy way to fund the government because that's just debt. It's money you have to repay later with interest. But even with all the money our government gets from bonds and the income tax, it still has a shortfall of about $3 billion a day. Now, how can they do that? How do they keep paying federal employees, Medicare recipients, Social Security recipients, defense contractors? How do you keep going when you're not taking in enough money? Well, J. Griffin explains the mechanism. Let's say that the federal government needs $1 billion this week to pay the salaries of the federal employees, and they don't have it. They send a representative of the Treasury over to the Fed building, which we see on the right, and at the Federal Reserve, a banker there literally writes out a check to the U.S. Treasury for $1 billion. But here's what you need to know. This $1 billion is not based on assets the Fed holds. It's fiat money. It's money created from nothing. Now, if you or I did that, we wrote a check, no assets to back it up, we'd go to jail. These guys do it, and it's perfectly legal. The term, technical term the Fed uses for it is monetizing the debt. You might wonder, well, that helps the government. How does it help these bankers? Well, some nice recent example would be the $700 billion Wall Street bailout. Just create that money from nothing, give it to your friends on Wall Street, right? This meant that the U.S. government, without raising taxes, could do business with big corporations, and in modern vernacular, your Bechtel, your Halliburton. And there are other mechanisms, tricky mechanisms, by which it benefited the bankers. This one is given by G. Edward Griffin. Now, he gave that example of the Federal Reserve creating $1 billion from nothing to pay the salary of the federal employees. Well, what are the federal employees going to do with that money? The bankers know. They're going to go deposit it in their banks. You just created $1 billion in bank deposits from nothing. How does a banker make his money? By loaning out money on deposit. The more that's on deposit, the more he makes. In fact, that $1 billion actually becomes $10 billion, because under the Federal Reserve's rules, a bank can loan out $10 for every $1 on deposit. What does that mean for the bankers? Endless profits. What does it mean for the rest of us? Endless inflation. Now, this is a woman in Germany in 1923. Look what she's doing. She's using money for fuel for a stove. Now, after World War I, Germany had to pay huge reparations to the Allies. To pay that debt, they started printing scads of money. It was so bad that a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks, and people used to walk down the street with their money in a wheelbarrow. You know, the Federal Reserve is doing the same thing today. It's not as bad as in Germany then, but they don't have to even print the money. Now they just create it electronically. Every time the Federal Reserve creates money from nothing, the value of the dollar goes down, and we get rising prices. Now, politicians love this system. You know why? Because by creating money from nothing at the Fed, you can spend money without raising taxes. Politicians have finally gotten the picture. If you raise taxes, it's a kiss of death at re-election time. In fact, President Bush Sr. learned when he broke his promise of read my lips, no new taxes. If you spend money by raising taxes, we will blame the politicians, but politicians know that if you raise money with the inflated dollar, that will happen is people will not blame Washington, they'll blame the local retail store and say, why are you guys jacking up your prices? But the problem isn't that prices are going up. The problem is that the value of the dollar is going down, and the culprit is the Fed. The bankers had a little problem, though. They figured a way to make billions of dollars in bank deposits out of nothing. But technically, that money still belongs to the depositors. To be profitable, they have to loan it to somebody. Now, who do you suppose they wanted to loan it to? Loan it to someone like me? No way, I'm not going to borrow that much, and my business might go belly up, maybe I won't repay the loan. They wanted to loan it to one particular guy. This guy, Uncle Sam. Same guy who they created it from originally. They wanted to loan it right back to Uncle Sam, because Uncle Sam ain't going to go belly up, and Uncle Sam is going to borrow a lot more than any individual or business will. And so that brings us to motive number 3, which is interest on loans to the American government. The Federal Reserve was empowered to buy and sell bonds for the U.S. government. Of course, anybody can buy a bond, but they knew that their own banking houses would buy up the grand majority of them at that time. Now, bankers still had a problem, though. We start loaning money to the American government through these bonds. How's American people going to pay back the interest on these bonds? Because at that time, 1913, our government actually didn't have that many sources of revenue. Chiefly it was tariffs and a couple of excise taxes. They came up with a solution, which was the income tax. There was no such thing as income tax in America before 1913. It was not in the Constitution. And in 1895, the Supreme Court ruled an income tax would be unconstitutional. The only way the bankers could get income tax passed was by a constitutional amendment. Now, guess which legislator introduced the income tax amendment?
Senator Nelson Aldrich.
You got it. The same man introduced the original Federal Reserve legislation, also introduced the income tax amendment. Now, why did Americans accept an income tax? Sounds silly today, doesn't it? Well, here's why. Originally, it was 1% of your income. Working man up to $20,000 would be like $500,000 in today's dollars. Just 1% of your income. And Senator Aldrich and other backers of the legislation swore on their word of honor as gentlemen, income tax will never go above 1% of your income. So Americans who were patriotic said, well, look, if Uncle Sam needs 1%, and I can always keep 99%, it's no skin off my back. But you know what happened? After a few years, taxes went up. They raised them a smidge, another smidge, another smidge, until now we're all paying 15, 25, 28, 33% of our income to the federal government, depending on bracket. So the bankers understood a principle. If you want to boil a frog, you can't just put that frog in boiling water, he'll jump out. If you want to boil a frog, you put him in lukewarm water, just gradually turn up the heat. That frog never even realizes he's been boiled, and that's what they did with income tax. Started it off at 1%. Now some people would object and say, Mr. Perloff, no way. Income tax soaks the rich. There's no way these guys would want that tax. Well, you know what? In 1970, I was 18 years old, and I was working for Kelly Labor in downtown Boston, making minimum wage, $1.80 an hour. You know what? I paid more income tax that year than the billionaire Nelson Rockefeller. He didn't pay 1 cent. We know that because he had to make his income tax returns public when he became vice president under Ford. In 1933, the Pecora hearings of Congress investigated J.P. Morgan. They found that the two previous years, 1931 and 1932, Mr. Morgan did not pay 1 cent of income tax to the American government. Income tax was for you, not for these guys. They avoid tax through a number of means, such as put it into tax-free foundations, which simply serve to advance their agenda while posing as charitable functions. Now, if you take a look at these years, 1913, the bankers have created the Federal Reserve, and they can now loan America billions of dollars at interest rates that they will set themselves. And also in 1913, they have created the income tax, which will force the American people to pay back the interest on their loans. Only one thing's missing. If only America had a reason to borrow money. If only America had a reason to borrow a lot of money. What happens in 1914? Yeah, 6 months after the Federal Reserve Act passes, Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated, World War I begins, we participate, and as a result of our participation, our national debt went from a relatively manageable $1 billion to $25 billion, and now it's skyrocketed out somewhere with, I don't know, many trillions of dollars. I don't think anybody knows how much it actually is. Now, some people have another way of explaining these dates, which is, hey, stuff happens. It's all just a bunch of coincidences, you know. Now, I've written a couple of books on creation versus evolution, you know, and I talk about the evidence against Darwin's theory of evolution. Sometimes people ask me, you know, well, this is a political discussion. It sounds like you've written on two totally different subjects here. Is there any connection? And there is. You know, in the books on creation, I talk about the fact that there's evidence that the world is designed. I mean, cells are just too complex, you know. The genetic code can't have come about by chance. Tonight is actually the flip side. Evil also occurs by design. As I said before, I believe in accidents, but not too often in the world of politics. By the way, it's even worse than we thought. As you know, there's a bill going through Congress to audit the Fed. At the urging of brave congressmen like Ron Paul, the Federal Reserve had already had a limited audit from the General Accounting Office, which revealed $16 trillion in bailouts to the big banks between 2007 and 2010. And this is actually on the GAO website. And it's not a type, this is not 2.5 billion, it's 2.5 trillion to Citigroup and 2 trillion to Morgan Stanley. Now, these are not actually bailouts in the strict sense. They are zero interest loans, very little of which has been repaid. And by the way, the guys at Morgan Stanley are smart enough to know that with inflation running about 9%, they do pay back that 2 trillion that they've borrowed 10 years from now, maybe worth only 1.2 trillion. So it actually equates to a gift of about $800 billion to Morgan Stanley. Note, by the way, that there are foreign banks on this list too, in Switzerland, Germany, Scotland, Bank of Scotland. Now, young Americans today are really struggling. And a young man might say to himself, well, you know, I just don't get it. You know, my great-grandfather came to this country at the turn of the century. He owned his own home. He had 7 kids. He worked 1 job. His wife never worked outside the home. How do they do it? Me and Mindy, we got 1 kid. 2 jobs. We can hardly pay the rent. Well, they say, what are we doing wrong? It's not what they are doing wrong, okay? When great-grandpa came here, there was no income tax. He got to, whatever he made, he got to keep. Now, the average American today spends about 50% of his income on taxes. It's true, when you take your federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security tax, real estate tax, sales tax, excise tax, all the taxes we pay, you're showing about 50% of your income in taxes. So does it make sense you now need 2 jobs to maintain the same standard of living as 1 job used to give you? Plus, when great-grandpa came here, he had a stable dollar. It was worth the same this year as last year and next year. It didn't lose 9% of its value like it is today. The government says it's 4%. We had a great article in New American about how the government has revised its method of figuring the CPI through each administration. You know, like under Reagan, they took out the cost of buying a home. And that isn't part of inflation, right? It's part of the cost of living, right? Inflation is actually about 9% today, and it is just wiping people out. But you'll be glad to know that the bankers have a solution. They really feel bad about this. They found a way to help us all out. That's why every day you get 3 offers for one of these in the mail. The bankers say, you know, we know you guys can't afford to pay for groceries this week, so just swipe some plastic, and we feel real bad for you guys, but of course we will have to charge you 14% interest on that. So it's quite a game, isn't it? Quite a gimmick. These guys create the taxes and inflation that rob us of our income, and they want to make up for it. We have to borrow the money back from them. You know, after so many years, Greenspan still has a great voice. Well, that completes part 2 of my talk. So let's take a break. Maybe someone needs to use the bathroom, which is down the hall, next to the counter there. And maybe you want to stretch your legs, and then we'll do our closing part 3. For 1, we inflate again, but this time money does not go back to its usual value, and then it just takes off like a skyrocket. Something must have happened, right? There's no effect without a cause. What was that cause? The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Now, the chairman of the Federal Reserve is November. That is not photoshopped in any way. That is an actual picture of Bernanke testifying before Congress. The Fed chairman has been called the economic czar of America because he and the Federal Reserve Board set interest rates. And by doing that, they also control the direction of the stock market. If they make interest rates go high, CDs will start to look attractive. People are going to take their money out of the riskier stock market. But if interest rates go really low like they are now, a lot of money is going to flow into the stock market. Now, how did the Federal Reserve get started? Most people would say, I have no idea. It must have been some act of our government, right? Yes, Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But who was the man who introduced the original legislation? Island meeting, and he wrote about it 25 years later. Here's what Frank Vanderlip wrote. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the terminal of the New Jersey Littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen. If it would be discovered that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. So is this man, Senator Nelson Aldrich. Now, most people today don't know who Nelson Aldrich was, but a lot of people still remember this man, Nelson Rockefeller. He was vice president under Gerald Ford, long governor of New York, a billionaire, one of the most powerful men in the world. His full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. It was named for his grandfather, Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and whose son, Winthrop Aldrich, became president of the Rockefeller's Chase National Bank. They were closely interlocked, and insiders knew that when Senator Aldrich spoke on Capitol Hill, he was speaking for the Rockefellers and their allies in the world of high finance. But here's what you need to know about the legislation that Aldrich brought forward for the Federal Reserve. He didn't write a word of it. The Federal Reserve legislation was actually carved out at a private 9-day meeting in secret on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia in 1910. Now, today Jekyll Island is open to the public, but at that time was the private retreat of the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Astors, and the Vanderbilts. And some people would say, well, Mr. Perloff, that's just a crazy conspiracy theory. Actually, it's not. You can go down to Jekyll Island today and stay at the Jekyll Island Club Hotel, and they'll let you see their Federal Reserve Room, which is the room, that's what they call it, the Federal Reserve Room, where the Federal Reserve legislation was written. And the guy who first broke the story on Jekyll Island was actually B.C. Forbes, founder of Forbes magazine. And one of the men who attended it, the meeting at Jekyll Island, wrote about it in his memoirs. Remember I was talking about the Spanish-American War and how National Citibank, the forerunner of Citibank, loaned America $200 million to fight that war? Well, that loan was negotiated by the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip. After the war, he left the government, and National Citibank rewarded him by making it their president. And as their president, he attended the Jekyll. For the last 50 years, no exceptions, overall prices have gone up in America. They have not gone down. So we've been lulled into thinking that inflation is inevitable, but it's not. I'm going to prove that. We're going to prove that right now. This is a graph from Oregon State University, price levels in America from 1665, the days of the Pilgrims, until now. I want you to notice that for the first 250 years of our history, there was zero net inflation. If you bought a pair of shoes in 1900, they would have cost you about the same as they did back in George Washington days. No inflation for 250 years, but look at that spike on the right. Now some people might say, well, Mr. Perloff, it wasn't a flat line back then. No, there were some blips in the graph. What were those blips? Those blips were wars. Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War. Well, what happened is, during these wars, the American government would print money to help pay the cost of the war. Of course, when you print money, money loses its value, prices go up. But notice that after those wars, prices always went back to their usual value. But check it out, World War